Okay, so now we have an understanding of kind of how to set up a switch statement and what it looks like. Now we're going to see it in action, so we're going to see the switch statement working so that we can really understand exactly how it works. So the example we're going to use is going to be of a character selecting an item from a backpack. So we'll have a few items in the backpack and we'll have kind of like an item that's chosen. This is going to be a variable, and we'll see what value that variable contains. We'll have a bunch of different print statements printing different things based on that value. So at the very end we're going to compare it to an if statement, so we'll see the switch statement for example first, and then I'll translate it to an if statement so that we can see the similarities and differences between the two. Okay, so now we've seen what a switch statement is, we've had that kind of intro, and we've seen how to set it up and kind of how it works. Now let's see it in action so that you can really get a good understanding of how a switch statement works. Now switch statements again are very similar to if statements, and in fact they're more simple than if statements because they're more restrictive in what we can do. So whereas with if statements we can test a variety of relationships and different conditions, with switch statements we're only testing one condition, and that's to see what the value of a variable is, and then we'll have some kind of code execute depending on what that value is. So to demonstrate a switch statement, I'm going to use this example of a character in a video game. So let's say this character has, I wanted to say a bunch of weapons, but I don't know, maybe some of you find that a little too violent. So maybe this character has some items in his or her backpack, and we just want to display different dialogue depending on what item the character chooses. So I'm just going to create this variable called item chosen. Maybe chosen item might be better. And we're just going to give this a type string, and we're going to, let's just initialize it to contain an empty string for now. We'll fill this string in just a second here. So we're going to set up our switch statement, and it's the first one that comes up once we start typing in switch. So I'm just going to double click on that, and it kind of gives us our template again. So the item we're testing to see the value of is going to be chosen item. And so the first case might be, what could a character in a video game have in his or her backpack? Well, maybe the character has some money, and if the character has some money, then we'll have some kind of code saying something like, and you'll get these errors a lot. That's just because we only have the template set up and not the actual code filled in. So just kind of ignore those errors until after we've set up our switch statement. So the first case is going to be money, and let's have our console print something like you can buy something. Okay, and don't worry about the error. Okay, and we're going to have another case, and let's say what else could this character have in his or her backpack? Well, maybe the character has a map, and could be something along the lines of you can find your way around. Okay, and let's have one more case. So what else could our character have in his or her backpack? Well, we've got money, we've got a map, maybe this character has a cell phone. So let's say cell phone, and in that case we can just print you can call a friend. Okay, and the default will just be I don't know what this is. And because if it's not one of these three things, perhaps a character has no idea what the item is. Okay, so we don't actually need to include the breaks in each case, but we can. So right now what's happening, I'm just going to run through how the switch statement is working, and then we're going to, well, I mean, we can kind of see something being printed out already, but basically we're seeing we have this variable chosen item, and we're saying what value does chosen item contain. The first case we're going to see if chosen item is equal to money, and if it is we're going to print something and then exit the switch statement. If it's not equal to money, we're going to test to see if it's equal to map. If it is, we print this and exit. If not, we'll see if it's equal to cell phone. If it's not, then we'll print this, and then if it's not, then that means it's not any of these three options, we're just going to print this out. So this is kind of like saying if chosen item equals money, then do this, else if chosen item equals map, then do this, else if chosen item equals cell phone, then do this, else print this. Okay? That's kind of like what it is. In fact, that's exactly what it's like doing. So we could refactor this into an if statement pretty easily if we wanted. Now, the main difference is that we're first only testing equality. So whereas with an if statement, again, we could kind of test to see if this is greater than or equal to, not equal to, less than or equal to. Whereas with the switch statement, we're just testing to see what this is equal to. Okay? And we can only test the same variable value each time. So we're really only interested in this one variable and what its value is. Okay, so that's where switch statements are useful. Now as you can see, we do get the code running and we do get something printed out, and we get I don't know what this is printed out. That's because our chosen item doesn't contain either the string money, map, or cell phone. So that's why we get this printed out, because we had the default case passing, whereas the first three failed. So switch statement is saying, okay, well it's not equal to money, or map, or cell phone, so just print this. If we then change this value to money, then we get a different thing printed out. We get you can buy something being printed out. And that's because our chosen item is equal to this string, and we've come across the first case and it's saying, oh, okay, well our chosen item is equal to money, so we print this and exit. Just like if we change this to map, then we get you can find your way around, and that's because the first case fails, so it tests the second case and this passes, so it exits. And the third and final one will be cell phone, and then we get you can call a friend being printed out. Okay, so that's a switch statement in action. This is how it works, and we've just kind of used the example of a character picking an item from a backpack perhaps. So the way this is pretty much the same thing as saying if chosen item is equal to money, then print this. I'm just going to copy and paste it. And then else if chosen item equals map, then do this. And I'm just going to type it out and have it here for your reference. Else if chosen item equals cell phone. And so yeah, I'll leave this and I'll include it in the source code so that you guys can kind of have this as a reference and you can see the two side by side. And then else print this. Okay, so this is exactly the same as this. So the functionality is exactly the same. Now let's see why we'd use one over the other. Well, personally, I think the switch statement actually looks kind of cleaner than this big if statement. There's kind of more space, and yeah, I personally think it looks cleaner. Also, the switch statement was faster to type out than the if statement, and although it was a small difference this time, that can make a big difference in the long run when you have a big program with a lot of switch statements. Okay, so and then the third difference is that this one is testing kind of what value this variable contains every single time, and that's all it can test. It's the only test it can run to see what value chosen item holds. Whereas with this if statement, we can say if chosen item is equal to this, else if, and then we could test something completely different, some other variable here. Okay, so in this case, switch statements are only testing the equality, testing to see what value this holds. And that's the fourth and final difference, is that with this if statement we can test other stuff than the equals. We could test stuff like less than, greater than, not equals to, or equals, whereas this one is only testing to see what chosen item equals. Okay, so those are the main four differences between switch statements and if statements. This example, we used a character kind of selecting an item from a backpack and having different print statements execute. If you see there, we get the same code executed twice, and that's because the functionality between these two, between the switch statement and the if statement, is pretty much exactly the same. Okay, so that's switch statements for you. Hopefully you have a pretty good understanding of how they work. If not, then kind of compare this switch statement to this if statement, and if you see the two side by side, you'll really be able to notice the similarities and differences and see exactly how these work. Okay, so that's switch statements for you. This next part will be dealing with while loops. Alright, so in this part we saw a switch statement in action. So we kind of had set it up before. This time we got to see exactly how it works and a real example. So our example that we used was we had this chosen item variable that contained some kind of a string value, and we were testing to see what exact value that string contains and had different messages print depending on what value it had. So this chosen item variable could have been one of three choices. We had first was money, then was map, and then was a cell phone. And we had different messages being printed out depending on what it had or what value it contained. So basically just tested this. Each case was testing one of those three options, and then the default case had a print statement as well. So we also compared this switch statement that we set up to an if statement. So we basically just recreated the switch statement in if statement form and compared the two side by side. So we saw that the big differences between the if statements and switch statements is that switch statements can really only test the value of a variable and see what value that variable contains. So what does this variable equal to, and then it will have some kind of code to execute based on that. Whereas with if statements we have a lot more freedom in what we can do, and we can test stuff like not equals, less than or equals to, greater than or equal to, and we can test completely different cases within the same if statement, whereas switch statements are just testing the value of the variable written after the word switch. Okay, so by now hopefully you have a good understanding of how switch statements work. If you don't, please go back and check them out because I think they're a great tool, and otherwise we'll move on to while loops.